All right, so this is just a brief introduction about H2S, excuse me. I keep saying OSHA. Anyway, and we're going to lead into Brandon's information. And just really quickly, Brandon was kind enough to join us to provide a story behind, these things we are dealing with in the workplace. Too often you get training on these hazards, you're protecting yourself, blah, blah, blah. People, they go through onboarding, they got refresher training every year, they get told how to do stuff on the jobs. And too often people, I think, are left not really relating to how hazards or situations maybe really are applicable to the things that they do. And they lose track of focus of what is needed to maintain their safety on a site. And so sometimes I think it's very helpful when you can have a story about a singular incident that can be very relatable and get those points across to people. It makes it something more memorable and keeps it in their mind so that they think about, that could have been me. So I got to be paying better attention when I'm out there in the field. So that's the kind of thing Brandon's going to kind of focus on, being a training manager with neighbors. I'm sure you stay very busy since how's that listed? Eastern Hemisphere? Western Hemisphere? I forget. What is it? Western, Northern? I don't know.
Yeah, so I
take hemisphere.
I take care of the Eastern Hemisphere. So that included me being up for meetings at 4 this morning.
All right, excellent. So you got a lot of training all over the place. It's Neighbors International. I like that. And it means you get to deal with stuff in all kinds of different areas of the world, different people, different cultural backgrounds. And that's another issue where a story can be very helpful to get to people, across the people that come from different backgrounds. Just the information you get in training too often, it's not very engaging. It can be a little boring sometimes, especially if it's been repeated often. So the stories, I do think, help to get stuff across. So let's give me about 10 minutes or so, and then we can roll on into Brandon and his story. I did say the unseen hazard. Why? Well, H2S is what? A gas, and it's got no color. You can't see it, but it does smell sometimes. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But yeah, it smells like rotten eggs if you happen to smell it. And it can be it's highly toxic and extremely flammable. Y'all, if you're working in the oil and gas industry in any kind of processing units, you're acquainted with some of the nature of how the H2S, if it's involved in the processes, can degrade the lines and the processing equipment. That's one of the things they have to deal with. Sometimes they can mitigate it, but sometimes that means you have to have a more vibrant inspection process of the equipment and stuff and stay on that thing. Otherwise, you can have things that fail on you accidentally, and you don't want that. So what can it do to you? Well, here's a whole list of stuff. It can cause irritation to the eyes and respiratory system. That's kind of one of the big ones there. You let it, if it gets high enough levels, and well, we'll get to that. If it gets high enough levels and for a prolonged period of time, the way it can really cause some serious damage to your eyes. You don't want that. I'm not sure about the apnea though. It causes problems with your sleep. So I guess if you're in an area that has some low levels for a prolonged period of time, like you're on the living quarters hanging out trying to sleep, it can cause problems with that. I wouldn't want to be on a site that I'm getting exposed to moderate levels of H2S constantly. That would be bad. Coma, convulsions, dizziness. Now, dizziness, pretty common one for the lower level exposures. And so it's a good signal one, where you're like, I'm not feeling right, Headache, weakness, irritability. I laughed and chuckled when I saw that one. I'm like, come on now. That's almost half the people I come across on a daily basis. Irritable. Insomnia. So that's another one of the sleep problems you can have. Stomach upset, and then of course death. Well, that's the ultimate culmination of exposure there. Now, OSHA has a lot to say about H2S in various standards. I didn't want to quote them all, so I just listed them. We got general industry, maritime, and construction are all areas where the H2S is brought up. Sometimes it's just kind of lumped in with other inhalation hazards. Sometimes they're specific to H2S, but as a company, part of your due diligence is to evaluate what kind of exposures you have on your job sites, your workplaces, et cetera, your processes, and determine what kind of, based on those exposures, what it is you need to do to ensure safety and health for your workers, right? So some of these, obviously not all these references are going to be applicable to every company. So it's important that a company does their due diligence researching this stuff and making sure that they're covering all their bases. Now, of course, this is to say, this is the stuff that is enforceable, right? You can be held liable legally with fines and other things for things we're not abiding to that are in these regulations. If that's at like one level, then there's sometimes best practices. There can be things that can be done better than even what the regulations stipulate. And so that's another lesson that companies can learn, is how they can do things even better than what's the requirement. And that's been one of my encouragements over the years, is trying to get companies to go above and beyond. Let's talk a little bit about exposure limits. Now, I thought this is one of those ones where if you're familiar with it, once again, the enforceability stuff, that's the PELs, permissible exposure limits. That's what we're held to account for, related to the exposures out there. But amazingly enough, sometimes other agencies, such as NIOSH, have RELs. These are recommended exposure limits that are lower. And it's like, well, gee, if NIOSH is recommending a lower limit, maybe that would be a better limit to stick with. I'm just saying. So the NIOSH REL for H2S is 10 parts per million. You're going to see that ppm a lot, so everyone should know parts per million. The PELs, it can depend a little bit on your industry. General industry has got a ceiling limit of 20. Now, you may have a short term up to 10 minutes of exposure of up to 50 ppm, and you're good to go according to OSHA's regulations there. I wouldn't recommend it. Construction and shipyards sticking with that 10 ppm for an 8-hour shift. Now, okay, I'm glad to see that they're actually using that NIOSH REL for their limits for those industries. However, keep in mind, they're showing this as an 8-hour limit. How often do you hear, I mean, you see it all the time, I'm sure, guys. People have 10-hour and 12-hour work shifts. So if that's at 10 parts per million on average over 10 or 12 hours, they're technically exceeding the limits. You gotta make an adjustment, figure out the new time weighted average for those. All right. Let your local CSP do that for you. Or IH guy. Hey, I see this. All right, let's talk a little bit about the concentrations now. We were talking about those parts per million. I pulled most of this stuff off of OSHA's website. By the way, I mean, if you want to delve into it, you can go to the cdc.gov or osha.gov. They have lots of information about inhalation hazards, H2S specifically. And so there's lots to be, garnered there. And this is actually, I've made my own little chart here. So very low concentrations, you see that, right? 0.01 to 1.5, you're going to smell it. That's that rotten egg smell we were talking about. 2 to 5, I need my glasses back on so I can actually. 2 to 5 parts per million. 2 to 5. Holy crap, that's low, isn't it? Prolonged exposure may cause nausea, tearing of the eyes, headaches, or loss of sleep. Wow, we're getting some significant impacts on us. Our maybe causing headaches could cause some problems with you focusing on your work. How about loss of sleep? That actually, if you have extended periods of lack of sleep, that also seriously impacts your ability to perform. Okay, let's just jump up to 20 parts per million. Remember, that's the limit, permissible exposure limit. Possible fatigue, loss of appetite, headache, poor memory, and dizziness. Okay, where could we have exposures to H2S? How about a drilling rig? Do we want anyone on the rig floor, much less the monkey board? That's the part that's up in the derrick where they're handling the pipe, getting dizzy? That would be bad. Now, I know they're supposed to be wearing their fall protection when they're up there, but hey, I don't want to trust that. It's just a little bit of H2S. You feel dizzy, you're fine. You're tied off. No, we don't want that. All right. Then we start to really climb 5 times the level of exposure, at least there, 100 to 150. Loss of smell. Okay. Now we got all these physical effects and how they're impacting you. And now, if it's high enough concentration, and it's not hard for it to get to this high, this level, by the way, then you don't smell it anymore. You can have those cases where it's been present in the area for a while at low levels. And if I'm not mistaken, if it's long enough exposure, sometimes that can wear out your sense of smell. It kind of starts to overpower you. But you can also get a short, quick dose that's already a higher level and you don't even smell it. So you don't have the initial warning. That's an important thing to consider. And we'll talk a little bit more about that related to monitoring. All right, now we're getting into really bad stuff here. 500 to 700, you could collapse in about 5 minutes from it. Serious damage to your eyes, death in 30 to 60 minutes. Then we jump to 700 to 1,000 parts per minute. Rapid unconsciousness, immediate collapse within 1 to 2 breaths and death in minutes. And I didn't put it on there, but they had 2,000 parts per million, instantaneous death. So, yeah, you definitely don't want to get caught in that. All right, moving on. Where does this stuff come from? So I put together some pictures. They had some different things we might deal with in different industries. Sewage sludge. Who just loves sewage sludge? Isn't it great? You ever seen that stuff being processed? It's a great place to hang out. No, I'm kidding. And then liquid manure. It's like, what's up with that? Well, it can be used for fertilizer. But, these things, they're decaying organic matter. They can, cause H2S as a byproduct, right? It's just kind of part of the process. How about natural gas? Anyone ever driven through an area where they got, it's swamps, right? You drive through a swamp where you got an area where they're actually actively drilling and producing gas, natural gas. Well, you might smell that H2S. It's part of what's to be expected as part of that process. Sulfur hot springs. Anyone been to Pagosa Springs, Colorado? Huh? No? Yes? I got to get one yes. Anyone in the back, in the crowd? I love that place. You go there in January and February, you freeze your butt off, but you get in the hot springs and you're half naked. That's great. But you got that lovely smell that, a lot of times it causes people like, I'm getting a headache. Oh, wow. Is there H2S there? Hey. Anyway, low levels. So otherwise they wouldn't allow you there. All right, moving on. How about some of these other processes? It could be a byproduct, right? Or used in the process itself. Petroleum production and refining, sewer and wastewater treatment, again, the sewage thing. Textile manufacturing. Now, feel free to Google and research where in the process is that come into play. On textiles, I have no freaking idea. I'm just saying. It was one of the ones. Agricultural silos and pits, actually. That if you think about it, you get these storage areas. A lot of times even it can be an open area, but it's in a low-lying spot, and they're just piling up material, stuff from either the refuse of agricultural activities. Sometimes it's manure, who knows, but they're piling these things up and they can start to emit those gases, and they might pool up or hang out in an area. That could be a problem. Pulp and paper processing, food processing, hot asphalt paving, and mining. I mean, come on, mining. Now they might be some of it with open pit mining, but particularly though, these ones where you're going in the ground, tunneling through areas you can expect, you're going to have different types of gases that you run across, right? Now we're not running around with the canary in a little cage anymore, thank goodness. But it's important to have something that warns them, hey, we're getting this exposure, something's coming out of the ground there. Like, well, yeah, that's why we move on to not just evaluating, but controlling it. Okay, so briefly, I don't know how we're doing on time, just fine, I hope. You got to evaluate and control the exposure. You need to protect your people from the H2S exposure. So you got to figure out if it's present or if it could be present. You got to figure out what is the likelihood, right, of what's your risk with that. And then what levels of exposure could you expect? So based on what's actually present, maybe historically has been present, or what you could expect to have present, a lot of study goes into all that. Then you're figuring out what levels. And so because of the levels of exposure, you might have certain things you need to do. Now, if you can, we think about the hierarchy of controls, right? Right, gang? Everyone familiar with that, I'm sure. Try to eliminate the sources. Hey, that's great. You can do that. Can't eliminate it. You got to control it some way, hopefully. There's maybe engineering controls. Great. That's not really doing the trick. Or in combination, administrative controls and safe work practices. Awesome. Guess what? We still couldn't reduce it to safe levels. Well, then we got to fall back on the lovely PPE. And people can always be relied upon to use their PPE properly and care for it well. Right? Everyone's like, no, that doesn't happen. That's a big problem, because a lot of times we're in circumstances where we have to rely on PPE to be the protective measure, at least the last one that gets it to where they're able to operate in safe levels, preventing the exposure. And part of the problem is, you provide the correct PPE. That's great. That's important. But you got to keep people well trained on how to use it and care for it and maintain it, right? So that the stuff is always working the way it's intended to work. So we identify these processes that could release or produce H2S. And here's the big one. Test, monitor that air. Okay, gang? There's a lot of variety and equipment out there. Google, H2S monitoring equipment, find quite a few vendors. But you need to know what it is you're testing for, and that the equipment is appropriate for that environment too. Because sometimes, as mentioned before, H2S is highly flammable and toxic. So we need to make sure, depending on the environment we're dealing with, it might have to have monitoring equipment that is, was it intrinsically safe, depending on the atmospheres, we got to deal with. There could be that. That could be a particular concern if you're working in confined spaces too. You got to have a qualified person, someone who's knowledgeable about all this stuff, right? We talked about the difference between qualified people and competent people. This is talking about qualified. They know what they're doing. Make sure you use the right testing equipment. Monitoring prior to entry or in the area, and at regular recommended intervals. A lot of that is discussed actually in the regulations, back to that those lovely OSHA references. There's actually a lot of other informational sources outside of OSHA though that talk about that kind of stuff. And to be honest, if y'all been out to jobs before in the field, my favorite actually are the ones that are continuous monitoring, and that's a great best practice in my opinion, because you never know. It's like, I understand maybe it's a low level risk, and so you're testing before you enter, and then every 30 minutes or every hour, whatever it might be, you're like popping it on and going, yep, we're good. It's like, I don't know, man. What if you have a really bad release right in the middle of that? It's like, I'd rather have continuous monitoring and have the little alarms go off. It'd be great. And then maybe y'all are familiar, sometimes the gang will be wearing these badges that they call them, these little H2S monitors. And you got to get them bump tested daily. Make sure they're properly calibrated and that they're maintaining their ability to read the numbers correctly. All right. There's some, we talked a little bit, mentioned briefly, engineering controls and things. You might be able to use exhaust and ventilation systems. Okay, that'd be great. Whether or not that gets it down to levels that are acceptable, still might not be able to do that. But if you lower those limits, that's great, the exposures, and then still have to use PP. You know what I mean? It's you're making it a little safer and better and less reliant on the PPE to do everything. And I'd rather not have to rely on PPE for the full protection, if you see what I'm saying there. Train and educate workers about hazards and controls. Training and education, right, Brandy? You're ready to talk about that, I'm sure. Establish some proper rescue procedures. Things don't always go well. What do we do in emergencies, and how do we respond? And it's important to be able to have someone who can respond in helping to get people out, or you maybe self-rescue. But you need to probably have SCBAs, that's self-contained breathing apparatus for all of us to know. Safety lines, maybe. That a lot of times is those environments where someone has to go in and you got an attendant keeping an eye on people, and you have a line that can be pulled back on. Moving on, we got respirators, right, and other people. One of the main distinctions on the respirators, under 100 ppm, air purified, something that just is purifying the air. Lots of different types of those, of course. But once you get above 100, and remember, this is after you've already done all the other measures you can, right? Hopefully, you need to use an SCBA because you're still at over 100 parts per million. Not good. All right, why is it so deadly? Well, mentioned the highly flammable and toxic, even at low concentration. Here's the big one right there, two of them. Heavier than air and may travel along the ground. So that stuff sticks low. Unfortunately, that means it's going to usually be in our breathing area, right? And it can build up in the low-lying areas, including enclosed, poorly ventilated areas. So, you know, this is a big issue with obviously confined spaces, but you go to some of these properties where these producing fields, and they can have lots of hills, you know, low-lying areas, and you can have processing equipment maybe that's leaking out H2S, or it's coming straight from a well, or even just from the ground in the area. That happens too. And the stuff just kind of hangs out in higher concentrations in the low-lying areas, and you're walking through or driving through, and oh well, darn, sucks to be you at that moment. You want to be properly prepared for that. After a while, at low or more quickly at high concentrations, I mentioned that earlier, you no longer smell it. You don't have that warning capability, and makes it less likely for you to be aware of the hazard, even being present anymore, and you don't have the appropriate response to it. It can quickly, almost immediately overcome unprepared workers, including rescuers. Now, it's interesting. This is where I'm getting ready to run out, move on into letting Brandon take over. I'm almost done here. We, as safety people, sometimes we like, you know, doing OSHA outreach training. You know, we regularly statistics are shared. That comes up with any kind of training. You can talk about statistics, right? It's like this many accidents occur per 100,000 people, or whatever the stupid numbers are, right? As far as getting some kind of rates, just to show people how much of a problem a hazard can be. And H2S is one of the leading causes of workplace gas inhalation deaths in the US. Now, the statistics I had here, I was trying to research more recent statistics, but without them actually explaining what everything means, those charts and things they give are not fun to try to figure out. So anyway, this is 2001 to 2010, H2S caused 60 worker deaths, they say. This is Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can go to their website and have a lot of fun looking at all their charts and data. Not a good time. All right, my point is though, you give all these statistics to people, you know, it's like, okay, that's interesting. And it goes in this one and goes out the other. It doesn't stick. It doesn't make, it's not of import to them. It doesn't, you know what I mean? It is important, but it doesn't make it to their brain as being important for them. Too many people don't look at themselves as being the statistic. And this is an interesting quote. It's attributed to Joseph Stalin, someone I don't look up to, I'm just saying. But a single death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths are a statistic. And I think that's very apropos. You look at statistics, it doesn't really tell you the story, and it doesn't make it relatable to you. You don't think about things unless it is that single death, something you can look at and learn from. All right, well, I'm dropping it there. I'm done. I'm going to let Brandon take over. So